This is the lecture we look at Islamic law. It's one of the historical developments. Islam has evolved, it's developed, and in many ways you can see the evolution of Islam. They have not been sitting still and twiddling their thumbs. They have dealt with situations as they came along, and they have figured things out. They have spent a lot of time thinking about law. In fact, Islam is law. That's really where it puts its emphasis. Whereas we would say it's grace and grace alone, Muslims would say it's law and law alone. There are some definitions that need to be given. One is what they call fiqh, F-I-Q-H, Islamic jurisprudence. And there is a glossary in the back of the field class notes. There it is. It says that Islamic jurisprudence, religious laws known by their founders, Sunni Muslims, divide up into 4 schools of law. Orthodox theology, law and rights, and there it has them there. Shiite Muslims have their own. And then just a little bit above that, it defines fatwa, a formal legal opinion issued by an alim, that's a scholar in Islam, on the status of any particular action, statement, or belief in line with Islamic law. Let me mention here the emphasis that Muslims give to knowing, and doing the right thing when it comes to the law. What does the law allow them to do? What's the right thing to do legally? This is what they're always thinking. You might be surprised, but there is, you can dial a sheikh. This is literally true. Dial, D-I-A-L, -a, sheikh, S-H-E-I-K-H. Or you can dial a fatwa. Dial -a fatwa. Fatwa meaning, sort of as I said a couple of minutes ago, a formal legal opinion. Muslims are always thinking about this. What's the right thing to do in this situation? About anything you can think of. What am I supposed to do? How can I handle this? In a place like, Al-Azhar University, they would get maybe 1,000 calls a day just in Cairo on what people asking what to do about this and what to be about that. Any question, things we wonder about too. What's the right thing to do? But they will dial a sheikh. That's what they do. I heard of one fellow who, and this all has to do with Islamic law and jurisprudence and so on. Heard of one fellow who he rented a car for the Hajj. In other words, you go over to Mecca and you have to go on the pilgrimage and you don't want to walk all over the place and play yourself out. So he rented a car and he made a deal with I believe it was some woman neighbor or somebody, that they would pay the rent together for this car. It wasn't a relative of his. But then he began to think, now this is really un-Islamic, and I could get into trouble for this, because even though I went ahead and did this and I promised to do it, it isn't Islamic, because you're not supposed to have anything to do with a woman who is not your wife or a relative or something like that. So what did he do? He dialed a sheikh, like just I mentioned there, dialed a sheikh, and the sheikh said absolutely unequivocally, no, this is against Islam and you can't do it. So what does he do? Well, guess. He dials another sheikh. He dials another sheikh and gets a second opinion. And then, and then he explains to him that he's made this promise and so on. And so the other sheikh says, yes, go ahead. So then he does it. But you see, there is this fatwa shopping, where you dial a sheikh and find out, what's the right thing to do. Trouble with Islam is, I think, that everybody's giving fatwas, and nobody really has the authority in Islam. You don't have a central authority, so you have all of these fatwas flowing all over the place. thousands of them every day. For instance, bin Laden in '96 put a fatwa against the United States. He is really not he's not one qualified. This is supposed to be done by someone who is theologically qualified, a cleric, to do it, but he does it. And just an example of somebody who's always issuing fatwas. Another famous fatwa was issued against Salman Rushdie when he came out with that book, Satanic Verses, because Salman Rushdie was a renegade. He was a heretic, and he wrote this very blasphemous book against Islam, and so Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa against him and offered $1 million on his head, and the fatwa has stayed and has not been removed, and then I think they upped the price to $2 million, but he has been protected by the British government. So thanks to the taxpayers of the UK, Salman Rushdie is still alive. We've already talked about something that we don't need to mention again, that the Sunni Muslims divide into 4 schools of Orthodox law, and each one of these guys lived and died in the 8th and 9th century, and each school of law was named after them. Hanafi, Malik, Shafi, Ahmad ibn Hanbal. The Shiite Muslims, on the other hand, have separate schools of Islamic jurisprudence, and they're connected with the 6th Imam, Jafar Sadiq. You see, so Shiite and Muslim have different ways, different judgments. In other words, the punishment for this is such and such, but for the punishment according to Sunni Islam is something else. That's one of the problems of putting in Islamic law, because it would be Sunni, presumably, if it's because that's what's the majority, and then the Shiites are going to suffer. Their Islamic law is different. There is this word kalam, which really means word. For example, it says that Jesus is the word of God. He's a kalam. And it is really, in this case, is Islamic theology, using rational arguments. The schools and interpretations, again, just briefly, we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this, but the Hanafis, Middle East and primarily South Asia, that means the Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, perhaps almost half of the Muslims in the world. The Maliki in Northwest and Central Africa, the Shafi in Southeast Asia, East Africa, Southern Arabian Peninsula, and then the Hanbalis, as we've said before, the purists and the absolutists in Saudi Arabia. These guys are pretty strict, to tell you the truth. One example is, what do you do about marital strife? All of the schools of law say you can have 4 wives, provided you can treat them equally. Trouble is, how do you know until it's too late? When a husband divorces his wife, the wife must marry someone else. All the schools of law say that. And the marriage must be consummated. But who wants that to happen? Because if the man wants to take her back again, it's too late, really. He has already blown it, and he's already, said, I divorce you 3 times, and so he's lost her, and she must marry somebody else before he gets her back again. Well, what they did was quite innovative. To fulfill all righteousness, they hired eunuchs and boys. Quite, I must say, creative. The Hanafis said that an abused wife cannot, listen to this, cannot file for divorce. So women have suffered a great deal, and I think this is true. The whole world knows it, though Muslim women don't want to admit it. They deny it. And I can remember just this past, almost a year ago, I did an interview in Christianity Today, interviewed somebody by the name of Dalia Mogahed, who co-authored a book, Who Speaks for Islam. She co-authored it with John Esposito. And this woman is Egyptian. She was born here in the States, though, very intelligent. And I interviewed her, and it was printed up, her full picture in Christianity Today. I did the best I could. questioning her on various things. She's very intelligent. She's a moderate Muslim. But I said, one of the things I said to her, I asked her about Muslim women who had derailed in one part of in Ontario a movement to bring in Islamic law, and the Muslim women said, no, we don't want it because it will turn against us and it'll be not favorable to us, and so they stood against it. And so I said, doesn't this show you that Muslim women don't want Islamic law? And she wouldn't admit it. Of course, she said, no, we didn't. We have to look at all the facts. So I was a bit disappointed that in some cases she wasn't as willing, even though she's a moderate Muslim, she wasn't willing to be open and honest about some of these things. She still tries to defend Islam to the death. And I've just recently heard that Dalia Mugahid is an advisor to President Barack Obama, a very intelligent woman indeed. But I wasn't particularly happy with the interview because I could only confront her so much. I couldn't tell her that she was full of beans. She was, in some cases, didn't cooperate the way that I wanted. The many countries have passed, as Muslim countries have passed, family laws. In other words, they have the women, you see, have agitated for it, and they're still in many ways put down and suffer, but they have pushed for easier family laws. Here are the sources of authority in Islam: the Quran, which we would know, and the traditions, of course, and then thirdly, consensus, analogy is the fourth one. So we'll see this in a minute in a chart. But here is the way it looks. The source, the Quran. The safeguard is God. Now that's a bit tricky because there's always an interpretation. The substance, this was in the Quran, in the case of the Quran, it was collated after Muhammad died, standardized under the Caliph Uthman, who tried to burn all other copies, competing copies, but didn't quite make it. Arthur Jeffrey, for example, who wrote the book, the material for the evidence for the material of the Quran, something like that, shows pictures of other competing manuscripts. The traditions, or the hadith, safeguard Muhammad. In other words, what did Muhammad say and do? You have 6 major Sunni schools, collections, and 3 major Shia collections. And then there's consensus. This is ijma. What is this? This is the community, more or less. In Sunni Islam, it's the community who discuss and talk about it. For Sunnis, it's the 4 schools of law. For the Shiites, the secret here is the imam. And these guys are the ones with the authority. Analogy, the other word, the Arabic word is qiyas, is where they look into the traditions, and they look into the history, and they look into the past, and they try to find analogies. In other words, this happened in such and such a time, and so it's like that case, and so on and on and on. So that's the 4th thing. Then, of course, besides that, you have the personal interpreter, or what they call the mujtahid, who struggles to figure this thing out, and you have in various schools the mujtahid, a personal interpreter of Islamic law. Now, let's look at this thing, for example, at a toothpick. Muslims look very seriously at a toothpick. I've seen many, many Muslims walking around with sort of like a twig. They've cut this thing out of a branch or something, and they've roughed up the edge of it, and they're rubbing their gums with it. Well, they're not doing that just to whiten their not, I shouldn't say rub their gums, but they're rubbing their teeth with it, and I suppose their gums as well. They're not doing it just to whiten their teeth. No, they're doing it because of Muhammad did it. Muhammad did this. He, after meals, and this is sunnah, he took this little stick and he cut it off, and he did this, and when Muslims do this, they're imitating him, they're copying him. You see, they're supposed to do exactly what Muhammad did, whether it's tying their shoes in a certain way, the way that he did various things. We could go into a lot of detail. So there is a report of this practice in the hadith transmitted through isnad. Isnad is that so-and-so said this, and then the other person, so you can trace it all the way down. That's the isnad. Isnad. Mujtahid is an authority who makes the original decisions of canon law. He studies this report, and he decides that the use of a toothpick is recommended not only for the Prophet, in other words, the Prophet did it, we see this, we know this, but for ordinary believers as well. You see, this is then becomes fiqh. This is a misspelling. It's not fig, it's fiqh. It is therefore included in the Sharia. So then a mufti, this is a legal functionary who may help a qadi, a judge, or someone like himself. He delivers a fatwa to an inquirer. So somebody has written in and said, shall I use a toothpick? And the fatwa comes back, yes, you can use, should use a toothpick. But it is only a recommendation. It's not the laws of the Medes and the Persians. So, in other words, if he doesn't use a toothpick, there's no penalty assigned because it's only a recommendation. See, this is the way it works. Now here's the chart. God, of course, we know that He is there, and as we've already talked, there's the Quran, there's the Sunnah, which is the practice of Muhammad, and ijma is in here too, agreement of the Muslim community. In other words, they get together and they decide about this thing. It could be a shura, a council or something. They get to decide on this thing. They've drawn from the Quran, they've drawn from the Sunnah, and there is this qiyas, which is looking back. In other words, as to the analogy, has it happened before, and if and when and where and how? And then there is the rai, which is an opinion, personal opinion by a jurist. So all of that, although the rai is not of a source, it's all fed in to this ijtihad, inquirer, by a mujtahid who's trying to figure this thing out. What's the right thing to do? Notice that you've got the Sunnah, the Hadith here, and the Isnad. It comes back from such and such and such, down and down and down, and it's come through a chain of reporters. So-and-so said this, and it's come down here, and then you have the ijtihad, where the mujtahid is making inquiry. That comes down to fiqh, which is the ruling, the specific ruling, and then comes the Sharia, the established way of life, and then comes the fatwa, which is the advisory decision of a mufti, what you have to do, and then comes the qadi. So that is a pretty good diagram showing, how it works. Look at how elaborate the system is. Look at how much Muslims have thought about this stuff. It's really quite significant, isn't it? Ijtihad, a word or two more about ijtihad, is effort. Effort to get to the right conclusion. This comes from the Hadith, and Muhammad asked a guy by the name of Muaz, a delegate, what system he uses to administer the regions under his control. And the guy said Quran. All right? And Muhammad says, and Muaz said Sunnah. What the Prophet said and did. And Muhammad said, and Muaz said personal effort. In other words, ijtihad, personal effort. Ijtihad is applied to situations that are not covered in the Quran and Sunnah by established precedent. Established precedent meaning what was done before. The word taqlid, copying, imitating, doing exactly what was done before. It's sort of a, I don't know, taqlid is stifling, stagnation. So Muslims they really need to approach the 21st century with some liberation. The trouble is that they have not. And it all goes back to the 10th century when basically they closed the gates. Sunni Islam closed the gates to innovative dealing with situations where you would deal with, interpret the Quran and come out with laws, Islamic laws that are appropriate, are modern, and somehow deal with the situation. I don't know if this is an adequate explanation or not, but it would seem that in reference to Islamic law, Sunnis have basically closed the gate. They're always looking over their shoulder because you see they're very much into law, and so there came a time when they wanted to seal things off. Let's just close the gates so that we don't go astray. Let's play it safe. Let's stand on what we have. And they closed the gate to law making. All they did then from then on was to look backward and find what was done before, to the stale and musty commentaries. But I think it's